Hello, I'm Robert Brown, Professor of Communications at Salem State University, adjunct professor at Harvard Extension School. I'm going to talk about corporate social responsibility today, third of the series of notes that I'm making for the Blanquerna School of Communications course for April and May 2011. Corporate social responsibility. Let me hold that up over here so you can see you've kind of got a short history of corporate social responsibility. If I hold up To Make a Difference, ARCO and Society, a social responsibility report that came out in the 80s. And over here, Starbucks. Starbucks Corporation, Corporate Social Responsibility Report, which was just a few years ago in 2008. I'm going to have my computer here to make to give you some notes on corporate social responsibility. It's good to be with you again. And here it is. Corporate social responsibility is a concept that students, young people today think was a result of corporations simply wanting to do good, or as the phrase goes, to do well by doing good. And to some extent that's true, but it's not completely true. There is another way to look at it, which I think is important for you to know, at least important for me to tell you, another interpretation. Corporate responsibility really involves a marketplace, what the scholar David Vogel at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley in the US, calls a market for virtue. I'll explain. The conventional wisdom is that corporate responsibility is doing well by doing good, but there's a difference. It's strategic. Corporate social responsibility is really a kind of crisis insurance. There's a relationship between two important areas or concepts or specialties in corporate management, in corporate communications management, in public relations. And they are crisis communication and management and corporate social responsibility. Try to keep those two concepts in mind at once, because one leads to the other to the other. They're really related. It's important to understand that. We're no strangers in this year of the Japanese nuclear meltdown, the tsunami, the tragedy there. We're no strangers to crisis, to organizations in crisis, to an entire Middle East uprising, crises there, to last year's British Petroleum terrible spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And we're no strangers to corporate social responsibility. The athletic shoemaker an apparel maker, Adidas, had at one time, not long ago, no fewer than 8 separate corporate social responsibility reports. So it's really important for corporations, for organizations, to be well-liked, to be well understood, to be transparent, to be accountable, to give back to the community, all of that. Let's see where that comes from. I'll talk quite specifically about the Atlantic Richfield Company, which was one of the largest oil and energy companies in the last half of the 20th century. Now it's really part of BP. It is one of the originators of the new wave of corporate social responsibility, a concept which has been around for a century. So it hasn't started, it didn't start in the 1960s with activism, with environmental activism and feminism and government regulation, but it really got a tremendous impetus from that intense period in the 1960s for several reasons. I wrote an article in the Public Relations Review, which was called Sea Change, Santa Barbara and the Eruption of Corporate Social Responsibility. And that is about what happened in 1969, in February 1969, January. The Union Oil Company had been drilling underneath the Santa Barbara Channel off the pristine, beautiful coast of Los Angeles, the coast of California, Southern California. Beautiful, pristine beach of Santa Barbara, beautiful, pristine beach of Los Angeles, and a wellhead at the bottom of the channel erupted, spewing oil onto the top. And this is really was obviously a PR disaster, but an environmental near disaster for California, and it created a crisis out of which I contend, I argue, in what I've written, that corporate social responsibility was born or erupted in a sense. For David Vogel, a scholar, well-known scholar in corporate social responsibility, CSR, corporate social responsibility, is how corporations buy and sell into the marketplace for virtue, because there's some choices to make in a marketplace. February 1969, the Union Oil wellhead broke, and in a crisis, what happens is there's an event and a problem and a breach, a break in the fabric, in the social fabric, in the social and economic fabric. And this breach widens out into a crisis. During this time, activist groups arise, and one of them was called Get Out Oil, or the facetious sounding acronym GOO, Get Out Oil. There were negative headlines. Public opinion went south, as we say, public opinion went very, very negative. People were afraid, as it's understandable they were. In the summer of 1969, just a few months after this wellhead was capped, U.S. President Richard Nixon signed an executive order creating the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I want you to think about that. There is a kind of rule of thumb in public relations that in issues management, that an issue takes about 7 years to emerge, be talked about, be buzzed about. And this is pre-web. Still some research is being done on this. It takes a long time until it gets to, it gets above the surface, it gets discussed, it gets debated, and becomes legislation. Well, this took months. And this is back before the web. This took just months until Richard Nixon signed an order creating a new government agency called the Environmental Protection Agency. I want to not digress so much, is to make a citation for you. In 1959, a biologist by the name of Rachel Carson wrote a book which was a devastating look at what chemicals were doing to the U.S. environment, to the world environment. Her book was called Silent Spring. It sold millions of copies. Every middle school, every high schooler, every grade schooler, every college student read this book, and every corporation and every legal counsel at a corporation, senior management read this book. Essentially, it said, we're poisoning ourselves. There arose the environmental movement. The environmental movement is very powerful, and this is 10 years before this Union Oil blowout. So the trend toward environmental consciousness was really given a tremendous shot by this powerful book. And in 1969, there was yet no environmental protection. It was under the auspices of another department, the Department of the Interior, headed by an executive in the Nixon cabinet. But when President Nixon and Walter Hickel, who was a name that doesn't have to mean anything, but they flew over this oil spill. They flew over the pristine beaches Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, where people were really worried about the oil coming and slicking on those beautiful beaches, and they knew that something had to be done. It went from buzz to legislation, and now we know obviously environmental protection, environmental consciousness is a major global issue, and the question of sustainability grew out of that. Now we call it that, but a major issue. And every time we see something like the nuclear partial meltdown in Fukushima and Honshu, or the BP oil spill, we're reminded of this. The first generation of corporate social responsibility was less strategic than tactical. I'm going to explain what I mean. It wasn't just that the Atlantic Richfield Company and companies like it spewed money out like a lawnmower, gave money to anyone who asked for it, any club, any organization, anybody wanting a scholarship, to health, to education, to the environment. But it was almost like that. It was almost untied to the marketing and strategic objectives of the organization. That had to change. The Corporate Social Responsibility Report, my favorite part, I'll get to this, is the last number of pages that details every single, you won't be able to see it on camera, but every single check to the dollar that went, hundreds of them, that went to organizations all over the country. This is a very interesting case because this is a global corporation with a reach into Indonesia, into the Middle East, and all over the United States and Alaska. Wherever that company, wherever Atlantic Richfield had operations, there it was under the scrutiny of public opinion. There it had to be thinking about its social responsibility, not only its environmental responsibility, air, water, land, but its social, its responsibility to do fair hiring, to be open and transparent, to respect diversity. It was then an emerging issue. Women were entering the workforce, so it really reshaped corporate philosophy. ARCO put out this report, which is almost 100 pages long in the late 80s. They started in the early 80s. ARCO, to make a difference, ARCO in society. And as I move along here, the total national grants that Atlantic Richfield gave out to lots of organizations that asked, $4,296,748. To education, the educational industry, as it were, educational institutions, 41%, almost half of that money, 2/5 of that money. About 20% went to environmental groups, 17% for community programs, 13% to the humanities and the arts. For public information, general public information, smaller percentage, 7%, health and medical, 3%. Now, it's important to recognize, perhaps the obvious, that an oil company, a chemical company, makes a big impact on society. There's drilling, there's environmental depredation, there's digging for coal. This is a company that had several connected companies: an oil company, a natural gas company, a transportation company, a coal company, a copper company. So its impact on the land and the sea and the air and on towns was tremendous. in a positive and negative sense. There were jobs, but there was also there were environmental issues as well. And so the corporation senior management began to really think about this. First thinking, what can we do reactively? And then thinking, how can we reshape the way we think about being a corporation? And what can we do to get out ahead of this? More than proactive, to really rethink what it means to be a corporation in the last half of the 20th century. That is not the same thing as being in the US, as being a corporation in the first half of the 20th century, especially the first decade or two, when, before the rise of the modern public relations industry, when corporations could say nothing, nothing to say, no comment, which we know is what we can't say now. And no wise and well-counseled organization will say no comment anymore. But that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what the communication stance of early 20th century and late 19th century corporations were before the rise of public relations. I want to just detail a couple of, this is my favorite thing to do, bear with me for a moment. Who got the money? Who got the money? A Better Chance, pre-college minority students, $50,000. The American Red Cross, $15,000. Albany Medical College, $25,000. Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, I'll say that again, the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, $150,000. The Council on Foreign Relations, $50,000. This is a company that got 27,000 barrels a day out of Indonesia. This is a globally focused company. The Thomas W. Dibley Jr. Geological Foundation of Santa Barbara, $10,000. Think about that. Think about that in terms of what I had mentioned at the beginning of this little talk, that it was Santa Barbara that was being affected by this, the Santa Barbara Channel. So naturally, the critics, of course, would say, these are bribes. But the classic definition of public relations is an adjustment to the needs, the priorities, the concerns, the anger, the frustrations, the hopes, the dreams of all the constituencies. And a large corporation may have 25, 50 or more important constituencies. Earthwatch in Belmont, Earthwatch, $22,400. East Los Angeles College, $40,000. Downtown LA was the corporate headquarters of Atlantic Richfield back then, still is. The Dance Theater of Harlem, $25,000. The Alaska Anthropological Association, $40,000. Why so much money to Alaska? The North Slope of Alaska was a huge find for the Atlantic Refining Company, for Richfield Oil. And it was what we used to call an elephant field, a gigantic field. And Alaska is a place that has been in the news for environmental issues, most famously with respect to Exxon and the Valdez disaster of 1989. This is before that. ARCO had operations in Alaska, and wherever ARCO had operations, it gave back. It answered, it replied. This sounds more strategic than it is. It's somewhat strategic, but not fully integrated with the marketing and other objectives of the organization, because it was a little improvisatory, if you will, a little scattered. Greenpeace, one of my favorite. Greenpeace, an adversary, if not enemy, of oil companies, companies promoting fossil fuels. They got $2,100, which raises, of course, the ethical question about should Greenpeace or the Sierra Club or other activist environmental organizations have taken any money from an oil company, their adversary. What for? ARCO's programs that are detailed in this report included a coalition to rebuild the Los Angeles Public Library after a fire destroyed it. An increase in the hiring and promotion of women. In the 1970s in the US, women began to enter the workforce. After World War II, women were not a big part of the workforce as they had been during the World War. They were largely homemakers in those days. But with the rise of feminism in the 1960s, a watershed cultural period in the United States and in Western Europe, women entered the workforce and then became an economic necessity. Now we have families not supported by a single male, but by two incomes. The company supported the Jesse Owens Games for young athletes. They produced economic textbooks for high school. They contracted with minority vendors. They sent a marine biologist to test the waters of the South Pole. Why? Because Atlantic Richfield is a company that, like other chemical and oil companies, had an impact on the oceans with their transportation fleet and with oil and gas development underseas. So they went to measure. They sent a wildlife biologist to examine eagles and their habitats. Were they being destroyed? How could they be repaired? And let me go back to ARCO also invested in solar energy. ARCO hired back in those days, hired a professional feature writer, me, to go and look at its activities in the areas that it was mining. But more than that, first of all, it sent me to research alternate energy. Solar, wind, trash, tides, shale, from shale to oil, any kind of alternate energy systems. Now, if this sounds familiar, it is, because we're living in a world which is hungry for fossil fuels, continues to be, and at the same time looking to find alternate ways of capturing energy which is safer and cleaner than fossil fuels, safer and cleaner, as we've seen now, than light water nuclear reactors. And nuclear was one of the mixes. But all of those were being explored, and Atlantic Richfield put out through its public relations department, through its public affairs department, a series of booklets, on the evidence of the contributions that alternate energy could make. They invested in fish farms. They gave Jacques Cousteau $5 million for a series on the health of the world's oceans. They also created a campaign that said the energy from the sun is cheap and clean, but it won't happen overnight. And really, that kind of gradualism is very interesting, culturally and politically. In a way, a critique of that could be could go back to the issues and the activism around race and gender in this country, in the U.S., and in other countries. Yes, you can have your rights, but you can't get them overnight. Yes, we can have women in positions of power, but that will take a while. We don't want to change too fast. ARCO had some solid economic reasons for this. It's pretty hard to run millions and millions and millions of automobiles on what? On the sun, on electricity. It's just really beginning now, again, because of a crisis. We don't have much of that yet. As popular as the Toyota Prius is, and as the Chevy Volt is becoming, and other electrified vehicles, largely our mobile pollution is the result of automobiles out there. The gradualism has been an issue in any great cultural change, and it also has been affected by corporate social responsibility. I could turn to, I will turn to a picture of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976. He probably, after John Maynard Keynes, in the first half of the 20th century, who was perhaps the most important economist in the first half of the 20th century, the British Lord Keynes, with his pump priming and his creation of wealth through government programs. Along comes Milton Friedman in the last half of the 20th century, and he said there's just too much regulation. His view of corporate social responsibility was very negative. He said it punished shareholders, and that corporations were already giving back. They were already, the charter for productive private sector was to create jobs, to create innovations. Apple, Sony, GM, Toyota, to create innovations, to create a tax base for governments at all levels, and to create wealth for shareholders, which can be turned into a job creation. So the private sector corporation, like an Atlantic Richfield, was not doing its duty to its major constituencies by entering into these corporate social responsibility programs, giving $4 million away of money that could be used to grow and innovate and create jobs and create wealth. So he thought of it as incredibly irresponsible. CSR was not the proper mission of corporations. The free market was giving back in all the ways that he mentioned. That he was an enemy of that. He saw it as a PR stunt. He saw it as acceding to small but very noisy, squeaky wheels, small constituencies of activists. Didn't make sense to him. This is what the CEO of Atlantic Richfield wrote, and it was perhaps ghost written for him, but this was his vision, the vision of the corporation, which was one of the founders of that CSR movement in the 60s. I quote, "A new ARCO has been born in the past 2 years. It is a company shaped by economic realities and sharply focused on its basic strengths as an integrated oil company attuned to today's challenging marketing. ARCO, however, has always been a corporation that is representative of more than basic bottom line competence." I just continue for a moment. Corporate social responsibility then was and is a philosophy. And that philosophy is carried forward here. I'm holding in my hand Starbucks, the Starbucks Corporate Social Responsibility Report. Maybe you have a Starbucks you call your own. You expect a lot from it. What is it that not just shareholders, I'm holding up the British Petroleum Annual Report, that is revenues, earnings, marketing metrics, financial performance. But in the last half of the 20th century, especially after the cultural revolutions of the 1960s, with race, with environment, with gender, and with other revolutions as well, stakeholders in organizations wanted more. Even shareholders in the stock wanted more. Not just bottom line confidence, to quote Lodrick Cook, the then CEO in the 80s of Atlantic Richfield, but they wanted a heart and a soul and a mind to be strategic and to be ethical. And to harken back to notes that I gave you in the first lecture to talk about James Grunig and the development of symmetry. And after all, symmetry was a theory that was then combined with management excellence theory, and it was for public relations, a theory about doing well by doing good. It was a theory that said there's really only one kind of effective public relations, one kind, and that's excellent and ethical. And he called that symmetric. We have critiques of this, but this has been a dominant research theory for generations. And for Howard Schultz, whose picture you cannot see here, for Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, which started with 3 stores in 1971 and has between 17 and 20,000 stores now, it really took up the legacy of Atlantic Richfield and companies like it in those days, 30 years later, to create a sense of corporate social responsibility, to invest in programs around coffee, around giving health benefits to baristas, around giving profit sharing to employees, doing those kinds of things which are, as in Lod Cook's phrase, and Walter Coyne's phrase, the senior writer and speechwriter I worked with at Atlantic Richfield, to beyond the bottom line competence. The last thing I will say about this is that these are programs that became possible because of the leadership of the top executive, the senior management, the CEO, the CFO, the chief of marketing, the chief of public affairs. These were the people who really bought into this. And I come back to my final point, around to the beginning. They bought into it because they were challenged by the crisis. The crises, what were the crises? An eruption of an environmental disaster, the cultural transformation of the perception of society, which became aware of Silent Spring, which became aware of the danger of chemicals, which became aware of a new way of looking at organizations, at corporations, at for-profit corporations, at chemical companies and oil companies. Also crises, cultural crises and opportunities created by the rise of awareness and demands for equal justice by minorities, by women, by youth, and by other segments in the society which had been perhaps overlooked or dominated, and by the power of the media, the headlines, the television, the coverage, the increasing sophistication and reach of the media. And after all, television was pretty much in its infancy in the 1950s. By the 1960s, by the end of the 1960s, still young, but it was showing the kinds of environmental depredations, the rise of radical youth, and the radicalism of the 1960s, the cultural radicalism was carried on television around the world. All of these combined to force the for-profit corporation, not only in the U.S., but in all societies that were democratic, capitalistic, not authoritarian, where persuasion and public relations and advertising, rather than coercion and violence and terror, underscored the operations of those societies. Those cultural forces created and shaped corporate social responsibility. Thank you for letting me share these notes with you.